Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Welcome to newcomers to the Facebook group, to our podcasts and to our Teachific resources. And if you're not a member of the Teacher's Toolkit Facebook group, we'd love you to join and introduce yourself. The reasons for this topic today, if we relate that to the classroom, what's the teaching struggle? And that's to be really thinking about, as teachers and leaders, we wonder what things make the biggest difference to the reading growth of children. And maybe not just the reading growth, but to language growth, language development and interest and engagement with language. And so through today's podcast, we're hoping we can be reflective and think about what experiences can we learn from that have worked well in communities that we hear about today, as well as what works in our own communities. And then how do we connect that with the research? So let's launch into thinking about access to books making all the difference. To this podcast, we welcome you especially, and to our guest. Ted Egan describes himself as an old bushie who lives in Alice Springs in the centre of Australia. And he, as a young 15-year-old, left Melbourne and has been in what he calls the bush ever since. Fascinated by Australian history, its unique people and the Australian way of life. And this comes through in the music and the books that Ted has written. A prolific writer, both songwriter and writer of books for the last 40 years. So not only has he written and recorded songs and filmed and written about Australian people, he's also created 13 one-hour documentary films called This Land Australia and 10 books that he's written. And I think well over 300 songs are part of his repertoire. So we welcome an absolute lover of language and words and music to talk to us today about his experience as a young man with a very small community and the vision and foresight of a policeman who thought books needed to be a cultural and important part of that community. We're absolutely thrilled that on this podcast we're welcoming Ted Egan to join us. So welcome to you, Ted.
Good morning, Sharon. It's Ted Egan speaking from Alice Springs. I'm an old chap, 90 years of age. I was born at an early age with my mother close by, and I've had a very happy life. And nowadays I'm cared for. I'm old physically, but mentally very alert, and I'm cared for by my wonderful wife, Neris, who anticipates my every need and looks after me. So life's good.
Beautiful. And we welcome you especially because it was in a Christmas holiday conversation with your son, in fact, that we came to be aware of a tremendous story that you have to do with the setup of a community library in a remote part of the territory. Is that correct? In Booraloola?
That's correct, yes.
Booraloola?
Let me start at the start. I was working for a government body called Native Affairs Branch, which was part of Northern Territory Administration. Our special job was to look after the best interests of Aboriginal people. And although nowadays bodies like that are criticised, it was a very happy time because they were positive days, and Aboriginal people were in a much better situation, dare I say, than many of them are today. I started with them in 1951, aged 19, and then in 1957 I was sent to Booraloola, which is a small, well, we'll call it a township, but a small place on the banks of the MacArthur River which runs in from the Gulf of Carpentaria in northern Australia. And we went out from Darwin, my wife at the time, Ray, R-A-E, and my two children, Greg Egan, who was 3 years of age, and my daughter Margaret, who was 3 months old, went by aeroplane, double-winged biplane. And it was interesting from the first moment because we took off and headed in a southeasterly direction. And the pilot said to me, "I've never been to Booraloola before. You know where it is?" And I said, "Well, if you don't know where it is, we're in strife." I said, "But I've never flown there before, but I know that it's on the banks of the MacArthur River. So if you keep your eye out, I'll spot, first of all, the Roper River, and then I'll guide you on to the MacArthur River. And I know that there's an airstrip there, and we'll land at the airstrip." So we eventually landed okay and arrived, and we lived in those times at the old police station, which had been set up in the 1890s at Booraloola. And there was just a quite substantial old house, but there were snakes galore. Every day you'd open a drawer and there'd be a snake in the drawer, or you'd find a snake in the wardrobe, and some of them were poisonous, and I learned to catch them and chuck them out. And of course we had Aboriginal people all around the place who were quite familiar with, but very frightened of snakes, justifiably. So we coped with the snakes, and to this day I say that Ray should have been given a medal for bravery for putting up with it, because she was in the house all the time. I was out doing my various chores, and I did everything from running the radio to the flying doctor service, to doing the weather observations, to doing the medical clinic for the Aboriginals. And I, of course, was starting to be aware of the fairly colourful history of the place. So I was there only a couple of weeks, and an old fella came up to me, an old white man, and he said to me, "Are you going to the church service on Sunday?" Now, I'd been around a bit, and I knew he wasn't talking about a church service. He was talking about a drink somewhere. I said, "Where's it on?" He said, "Down by the creek under the mango trees at Albert Morecambe's camp." And Albert Morecambe was one of many white men who lived at Booraloola. And so I said, "I'll be down on Sunday morning." So on the following Sunday, I walked down to Albert Morecambe's camp, and there, sitting on several old army stretcher beds, was this group of white men sitting around in a ring, and lots of Aboriginal people doing this and that on the outskirts of the meeting, and everybody looking after one another, and all very happy. And so they said to me, "Sit down, son." So I sat down on one of the beds, but suddenly they launched into the debate. And I quickly realised that they had these debates every Sunday morning, but they launched into this debate. I can't remember the title of the first debate, but you can bet your life that every Sunday thereafter I joined them. And the subjects of the debates were quite erudite. I remember once was, "Is there a future for Buddhism?" And will Charles Dickens survive? And that sort of thing. And the most memorable one I remember was a fierce, they almost came to fisticuffs over the relative merits of Gray and Browning. And there was a particular fellow there named Roger Jose, and he was obviously, and after a couple of debates I realised he was the great scholar among them, but they were all pretty good. And I came to realise that they were all the beneficiaries of the wonderful library that had been established at Booraloola in the 1890s. Now, nobody knows his name, but a young policeman was posted to be the sole police officer at Booraloola, and he was in for a very lonely time over the wet season. But he had a pedal radio in those days, and he sent off a series of telegrams to various bodies that he had researched and become aware of, and asked for assistance in cultural terms for the community at Booraloola. And so the word went round the philanthropic tracks that Booraloola was in need of cultural assistance, and various bodies throughout the world provided A, money, or B, books to be sent to Booraloola. And the principal organiser was the librarian in the library in Darwin. And I forget his name now, but he organised for the books to be sent to Booraloola and for funds to be used to buy. And they were leather-bound classic books. And after about 6 months, Booraloola had shipped to it about 1,000, mostly leather-bound classic books. And the policeman, in his wisdom, set up the Booraloola Library in the jail cell. There was a little building which was the cell. And of course, all these now old white men who'd been living in the region for many years, they'd all been put in jail for various reasons. And while in jail, they shared the benefits of all these wonderful books, and they accrued an incredible, very pleasing level of scholarship among them. But Roger Jose, who'd been in jail for various so-called crimes, he'd been put in jail for pinching cattle. He'd been put in jail for supplying liquor to Aboriginal people, and he'd been put in jail on another occasion for stealing cattle and tree-panging without a licence. Tree-pang is a sea cucumber that grows in the region in the coastal beaches, and it's a highly prized delicacy for Chinese markets. And so they'd all been tree-pangers and potty dodgers and over the years, and it served the various stretches in the slammer, and that accrued this incredible fund of knowledge. And Roger, in particular, on that debate I was talking about, the relative merits of Gray and Browning, he was a great Gray fan. And he recited totally Gray's elegy in a churchyard, and it was just profound stuff. And he had a resounding win in the debate on that day against most of the others who were less informed but Browning fans. So I used to sit in awe at their feet. And they all had these fancy nicknames. There was the Reluctant Saddler, there was the Whispering Baritone, there was the White Stallion, there was the Mad Fiddler. And Roger Jose, who was a white man, he didn't have a nickname. He was just called Old Roger. But one day I heard another less informed white person discussing the Hermits of Booraloola, as they were known, and he referred to Old Roger as the bloody old Death Adder. And I thought that's a pretty awful nickname to bestow on this wonderful scholar. So I wrote my first ever song, which was titled Roger Was No Death Adder. Get a picture of the man. He had a long beard halfway down his chest, piercing blue eyes, and he had these theories. And he had a theory about housing. He said, look at the stupid people of Booraloola where you get cyclones. He said, they all live in square houses that blow away. He said, what you need is a roundhouse. So he built himself a beautiful roundhouse. The ground floor was a 10,000-gallon rainwater tank turned upside down with a hole cut in the side. And the mezzanine floor sitting on the top of that was a 5,000-gallon tank. And out in the backyard, about 50 yards away, was what he called the amenities block. It was, of course, the dunny, but he wouldn't use crude words like dunny, so he called it the amenities block. That was one of his theories. His other theory was about clothing. He said, these stupid Australians, he said, when it's hot weather, they take their clothes off. He said, the Arabs don't, do they? He said, the Arabs cover up. And in the hottest days in the wet season, which was when I arrived, he would have 2 or 3 of those, remember those old grey flannel singlets that your grandfather used to wear with short sleeves and a couple of buttons?
Yes.
He'd have 2 of those on and an army greatcoat and a scarf round his neck and a turban round his neck made out of a pillowcase. And he said, it's like... what's the word? Capillary action. It's all like that. He said, I sweat a bit inside and the cool breezes float through my body, he says, and not like those silly white people. And anyway, he had all these theories. And so I was thinking about this song that I was going to write about him, but I was studying these Hermits of Booraloola pretty closely. And one day, another young mixed-race young man named Hector Anderson, he was the son of the Andy Anderson, who was a partner of Roger Jose's. And Hector and I went out and we rode our horses out and we killed a wild bullock. And they call it overlanded. And we overlanded, we cut it up on the ground and we put the various slices of meat into various bags on a pack horse and took them back to we salted some of the meat. And I thought, I'll take a bit of beef over to Roger. And he lived in his rainwater tank on the other side of the airstrip. And so I walked across. I had 2 little bags of beef in each hand. And one was fresh meat and the other was salt meat. And as I approached his camp, he was sitting outside his the round tank and he was talking to himself. And I thought, I better not interrupt this because it's obviously an important conversation he's having. So when he'd obviously finished, I walked in and I said, "Good morning, Roger." He said, "Hello, young man." And I said, "I brought you over some beef, some fresh meat, and here it is, and some salt." He said, "Oh, thank you, young man." He said, "One often sits here and craves one of the master's oxen, but far too often I have to go out and slaughter yet another poor marsupial." So he put the meat in his coolguarding safe and he sat down. And I thought, now I've got him. I'll ask him a few questions. I said, "I noted you talking to yourself as I arrived today." And he said, "Yes." He said, "I often do that." He said, "Since I developed my superiority complex," he said, "it's nice to talk to an intelligent person every now and again." I wasn't quite too sure how to take that one. That's an introduction to Roger Joseph, the Hermits of Booraloola, and the library, which is often called the Carnegie Library, but it's not really totally as a consequence of the Carnegie Institute in the United States, but they did assist and they deserve a mention. The library was in existence at Booraloola for over 50 years. And as I say, all sorts of people went into jail and read the books, the various books. By the time I arrived, I went looking for the library in the awareness that it had once existed.
Yeah.
And there were only a few ant-eaten dust covers left. And I didn't find any single book, just a few remnants of books. A very happy place and a wonderful Aboriginal community there. And we had a great time at Booraloola. And I will always treasure my memories of the Sunday morning debates. So I hope that's given you some insight into the library at Booraloola.
Yes. So, Ted, you said earlier on that there were a number of philanthropists that were involved in the establishment of the library.
Yes, and I don't know who they were, but the librarian in Darwin, whose name I did have, but anyway, his name's not important, but he was the official librarian in Darwin. He knew the policeman, and he arranged for some of these grants of money to go towards the purchase of appropriate books. And as I said, Roger could give you great bursts of Virgil's Aeneid, Homer's Odyssey, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. He knew them all off by heart. And indeed, when Arthur Calwell, the famous Labor politician, who wasn't a very good politician, but he was a very good scholar of Chinese history, he came to Booraloola while I was there. And he and Roger sat down and they discussed the Ming dynasty and all sorts of really learned things. And Arthur Calwell was amazed at the level of scholarship of Roger Joseph.
So how old would have Roger been when that library arrived?
Oh, when that arrived, he went into Booraloola in 1917. So the library would have been in existence. And there's a very famous book called Robbery Under Arms. And I've written a song about a man named Harry Redford, who was in fact the inspiration for Rolf Boldrewood to write Robbery Under Arms, because Harry Redford once stole 1,000 head of cattle and walked them across Australia and became very famous as a consequence. And he finished up quite a respectable gentleman in his later life, and he lived at Booraloola, or in the Booraloola region, and was one of the officials of the Booraloola Library, which came to be called, as I keep saying, the Carnegie Library, but it wasn't, in fact, solely responsible. The Carnegie Institute wasn't the only contributor to the library. They were important and certainly one of the major contributors, but there were other people in the southern regions of Australia who'd sent money for this good purpose of bringing culture to the north. They did a good job.
Which is interesting, isn't it, that at the time, because when I was looking up, doing a little bit of research about the Carnegie Corporation, that after, setting up in New York and in the States, and I think, the trust was established for the advancement and diffusion of knowledge in the United States of America. But then by 1917, Canada, South Africa, West Indies, Australia, New Zealand all became beneficiaries of funds that not only were for education, but for health, for peacekeeping, but they were actually, I found it interesting to find out that they were the ones, the Carnegie Corporation, in fact, funded the foundation of the Australian Council for Education Research.
Yeah, that's very famous, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, they were undoubtedly a great philanthropic body. Americans are terrific at
Yes.
philanthropy, and but probably better than any other country in the world, and that's one of their big pluses.
And then I found, so there were 4 town libraries that they funded in Australia, one in Hobart, one in, not sure where it was, in Western Australia, and 2 in Victoria, one in Mildura and one in Northcote.
Yeah. Well, of course, the various mechanics institutes around Australia are indicative of the fact that libraries were all the go.
Yes.
And my own father, who went to primary school only to grade 4 and then had to leave and work on the family farm, he used to always say, I had to leave when I was in grade 4 because my father was in grade 5. And that wasn't true, of course, but he finished up with a level of learning that would have easily got him a job as a professor of political science, my dad, who was an extremely learned man based on the books he'd read during the Depression years, especially when work was so hard to get.
Yeah.
And so reading was a big go in those days.
Yes,
and,
it was, wasn't it? And it just you bringing up the Mechanics Institute, was that across Australia?
Oh, yes,
Mechanics
every
Institute,
state,
yes.
Yes.
So, in fact, it's a bit deceiving. It was called the Mechanics Institute, but in fact, in every Mechanics Institute was a collection of books that had been...
Yes. They were more or less art centres rather than not mechanics in the sense of the term we know.
No.
But mechanics, they were one, and usually architecturally delightful. Stone buildings, and they're forever.
Yes, I just think this is such an interesting story for us in Australia, and to think about the importance of bringing books to communities and the impact that then has, so that people can access, whilst we might not have had for many children, they weren't always able to go a long way through their school life, but having access, at least every town, whether it was a little country town or even more remote, like, I've forgotten the name.
Booraloola, the Loo.
Yes. That also took some foresight from that policeman to look for funding to bring to the community. So in 1890, when it was set up, so what made that community? Like, how many people were there? What was
there would have been, it's a beautiful place physically. There's a lovely freshwater river, which is 50 miles inland, but at the entrance into the Gulf of Carpentaria, it's tidal, of course, but it's freshwater at Booraloola. There are a few crocs. It's great cattle country, and it was very good country for Aboriginal people in the traditional hunting days. There's still a great level of knowledge, traditional knowledge, and the languages are still... The Garawa and Yanyula people, and their languages are still alive and well and used and taught to the kids in the schools these days. They were very, very happy times, and you never ever saw cruelty or hardship at all, because all the Aboriginal people used to work on cattle stations on the Barkly Tableland during the dry season. They would come back for all the ceremonial activities that they needed to pursue during the wet season. And it was very happy times there, and they got on famously with the small white population. There's a bigger population there now because there's a bit of mining and other things happening there in addition. But in those days, there were probably 20 white people and 500-600 Aboriginal people, and really good relationships all round, and lots of laughter and happiness.
So those books were stored solely in that jail?
It was a little corrugated iron building with one tiny little window, so it would have been like an oven for a lot of the year, because it's a very hot place, Booraloola. And of course you'd have a few snakes and other activities going on. But the shelves were still there, but of course the white ants had eventually eaten all the books, and the books had been stolen and borrowed and
been read and loved.
Yes, in their day they'd been read and loved. Yes.
Oh, well, I love that there was all those years later, the impact of that learning.
Because of the discussions that used to go on, a lot of the Aboriginal people, they of course had their tribal names and their skin classifications to determine who married whom and so on. But though in terms of English names, a lot of them had been given names like Virgil and Homer and Pompey and Nero, and to this day there's still a few fancy names around Booraloola among the Aboriginal people.
Literary names.
Yes, literary names.
Yeah,
yes.
Beautiful.
And Andy Anderson, I mentioned his son Hector, that we went out and killed the bullock together, and they were his three mixed race sons were originally called Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin, but they became Lenny and Henry and Steve over the years, yeah.
Actually, there's two things I want to ask. One is, so those debates, were really, like that was just part of the culture then of Booraloola, wasn't it? That ongoing, because they had read widely and because they had read from a collection.
Yes.
That it was to be able to debate those things. More than one person has read the book.
Yes. Well, they would have the debate this week, and then at the end they'd have a final drink. And if they had rum, that'd be fine. If it was just a cup of tea, that was fine. And there were behavioural standards that everyone insisted on, and most abided by. But they would then set the topic for next week. And then they'd sit down and Roger would be writing out his thoughts for next week's debate for most of the preceding week.
Yes.
Unless, of course, he had to go out and slaughter yet another marsupial.
Yes. And then that brings me to the second question that I have around, so you said there was a collection of about 1,000 books and most of them
originally,
were... Yes, and most of them were classics.
Yes.
So... The complexity of reading involved in those texts, the more they read, the better they got as, anybody.
Yes, and, a lot of them were in Latin and Greek.
Yes,
I don't know whether any of them could read the Greek alphabet, but Roger could certainly give you great bursts of Virgil's Aeneid in Latin and Homer's Odyssey and the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. He loved that one, of course, because enabled him to really deliver the goods, and he was just an amazing man. He wasn't just some show pony. He was a quite wonderful scholar, and it was David Attenborough who bestowed the nickname Hermits of Booraloola on them. And I have always at the back of my mind, my wife Neris one morning sat up in bed, and we've just finished a musical that we've been working for 15 years on, and she sat up this other morning, and we'd been talking the previous night, and she sat up and she the Hermits of Booraloola. And for the next few days, we tossed around ideas for songs, which are still in between my ears somewhere among my various themes.
Yes.
Who knows? I'm only 90 now. Who knows what might happen?
Oh, well, we haven't even talked, Ted, about what has happened. Apart from Booraloola, we've got lots for you to share here. So you're a writer, a singer, songwriter, but writer of books, and have you written film scripts?
My wife Neris wrote a film script titled The Drover's Boy, and we tried for 15 years to get it off the ground, but I won't bore you with the details, but it didn't happen, and the story's still there. The story will be told one day because it's a wonderful part of Australian history. And
yes, which you are fascinated by, aren't you? Australian history for you.
Yeah. I've, as I mentioned earlier, I think I've done 31 albums of songs, and I have 380-something registered with APRA, of course. And I checked only a couple of years ago, and about 80% of my songs are about people I admire, and they're little old Chinese grandmothers and old drovers and prospectors, and I don't seek to write songs to put people down, but constantly working on themes of new songs. My most recent one is in French, and although I'm not a French speaker, I'm a good parrot and I can handle the French language, and I sat down and wrote this song in French, and sent it to a couple of my French-speaking mentors, and they a few corrections, but they said it's lovely. So I'll be hopefully getting a bit of airplay around that within the next few months. Yeah.
My word! And is that about a person?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
I'll test your musical memory. Are you ready?
Right.
Da da dee da 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 dee da 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 da. You joining in?
Yeah. I can't get the words.
Here's the words.
Dominique.
Dominique, que sangale tout simplement. Otier, pove chantant. En tout chemin, en tout lieu, il ne parle que du bon Dieu. Il ne parle que du bon Dieu. Now, the writer of that was a French-speaking Belgian nun who came to be known as Sœur Seria, Sister Smile, and she wrote that incredible song in 1963. I was teaching in 1965 at a place called Newcastle Waters in the Northern Territory, and I heard the song and I loved it. And I had 25 pupils at my little one-teacher school, 3 of my own kids, Greg, Margaret and Mark, and 22 Aboriginal kids from the nearby cattle station. And I taught them that song, and to this day they all sing it in flawless French. Oh. And my 3 kids can still remember the words. And next time you see Greg, ask him and he'll sing it for you.
I will indeed.
But Thursaria had the most tragic life imaginable. And I won't give you the detail because I researched her life later on. And if you said, write me the most tragic life story you can imagine, you couldn't do anything more tragic than hers was, in fact. So I've written a song, it's called La Rossignol ne chantera plus. The nightingale will never sing again. Yeah. So that's, I'm constantly on the lookout for themes for songs and the way I go.
But mostly about people. That's your fascination, isn't it?
Yeah, people are.
Not just your fascination, but you love to observe and listen and learn and find out.
Yeah, well, skiting a bit more. In May, this coming May, where Neris and I are going to Sydney, I wrote a song called The Paragon Cafe about the various Greek cafes, not restaurants, that were used to be in every country town in Australia, all had fancy names. And I wrote it, and it's basically the life story of Konstantinos Varapatis, born in Kitara, and then he comes to Australia. He opens up the Paragon Cafe, and eventually his promised bride comes out, and she's never met him. And the man who greeted her at Sydney's dockyard was strong, he was handsome. He was strong, he was kind, and oh, he was so handsome. They travelled on the train to the town called Wagga Wagga. The Paragon Cafe was to be her future home. And they go on and they have their 5 kids and they run the cafe. So that's another song that's getting some mileage this year. Late in May, I then go to Darwin, and I wrote a song years ago about a wonderful old Chinese grandma. Grandmother of my dearest friend. His name was Chin Chu Hung, and her name was Granny Lam Loy, and I wrote a song about her, and there's a big gathering to honour her in May this year in Darwin, so Neris and I are going for that as well. And I get great delight out of studying, listening to. I ask thousands of questions of these interesting people I meet in my life, and I compose songs about them. I can't put dots on lines, but I make up my songs.
Wow. So what do you think, or who do you think made you or helped you be so interested in others and to want to find out more about people?
Well, my family, my childhood life was just so happy. I don't remember a crossword in our very humble suburban house in Melbourne up to the time I was 15, and then I left home with my parents' blessing and suggestions and warmed to the idea of me getting away and travelling and learn to live off my... But we were reared on music and love, and my mum an interesting story. My mum taught us all a song called Two Little Boys, which she remembered as a girl from her girlhood days.
Yes.
And I eventually taught it to Rolf Harris, now sadly discredited, but Rolf recorded the song and made it, put the Beatles off the top of the charts in 1969 with that song. I didn't claim to have written it. I just claimed to have taught it to Rolf, and he did it, and was until Elton John wrote Candle in the Wind for both Marilyn Monroe and Princess Diana.
Yes.
Two Little Boys was the biggest selling single record of all time.
Oh,
it sold a million copies one Saturday morning.
Oh, my word.
Yeah.
Oh, well, so I grew up with that song.
Yeah, well, everyone thinks it was an Egan family song because we were the only ones who sang it. But we eventually established that it was written by two Americans named Madden and Morse.
Right.
And so Rolf brought it to world fame. So a happy childhood based on music.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. And so really lots of, music and story through music, isn't it? It's all of that.
My mother was a wonderful child psychologist. She used to, we'd have our tea every night, as we called dinner, tea.
Yes.
And then she'd say, right, let's do the dishes. Now, she didn't do the dishes. She'd done the cooking. So we four, my three sisters, then me, and eventually my younger brother, Tim, who's still in Melbourne, we would do the dishes, and you'd be prolonging the dishes, you'd be wiping away on a plate because you would say, let's hear now the Irish chanting car. So I am an Irish car, and all Ireland is my home. And so we'd sing that, and then she'd say, what about so-and-so? And we'd sing that. And if she heard a song on the radio, she'd say to my sisters, put that on the repertoire, girls. And they were all typists and stenographers. And my two elder sisters could go straight to the piano and play any song they'd heard on the wall. Straight away, no, not just vamping, playing the actual tune, and they were just brilliant to be among. And my dad played the squeeze box, and my mum just sat there looking pleased. Yeah.
And then were you writing songs before you left home?
No, Roger Jost was my first one. That was 1957.
Okay.
And but I used to, when I went to Darwin at age 16, 17, I used to sing all the old American Western ones like Mule Train, Ghost Riders in the Sky, High Noon, Cool Clear Water. And then I started doing parodies on various characters around Darwin. But I realised that here I was among these amazing characters and their backgrounds and the various goings on, and began to start composing my own songs. I can't do dots on lines. If I get a theme, a tune presents itself at the same time, and it might take 10 minutes or it might take 15 years, as the Drover's Boy did. I knew what I wanted to write, but I just needed that catalyst, and eventually I wrote the song in 10, as I keep saying, 15 years and 20 minutes. I wrote. Yeah.
Yeah. So you had access, just like that, the library access that we've been talking about, access to all of those books. You had 15 years of access to songs every day.
Yes.
Songs and music.
Well, there was no television in my childhood, and we'd all sit and listen to the various things on the hit parade and the various Lux plays and so on. And I'm now totally lost around computers and phones and all the electronic stuff because it's a different language for me. That's my greatest difficulty. But I get by with a lot of help from Neris and my family, my wonderful family.
Yes. Well, look, you're podcasting, Ted. You're podcasting.
Yes. And, we've just done this musical, Balls and Chains.
Yes.
And Greg, my son, who you know, has done the recorded songs in podcast style for us. Not quite sure how I'm going to do it because I use the word, but I have no idea how to market the product. But I'm aware of the word, and I know it's the way to go these days. So I'm going that way slowly but surely.
Well, thankfully, you're going full on with what you are just so brilliant at. You're singing,
Well,
you're creating music, you're writing, you're bringing people to life through song.
yeah, well, it's an essential part of me, so I better keep
Yes.
doing it or I'll get into trouble.
Oh, so out of the music that you were introduced to as a child, what would you say might be the music that had the biggest impact on you?
Oh, the Irish heritage, I think. There is a Cornishman in my ancestry, but I'm 100% Celt in genetic terms. And Nerys is born in Wales, and she's a beautiful singer. And so I'm surrounded by Celtic intrigue, and the Celts were not very good at saving money, but they were good at singing songs and composing songs and sharing music and lots of happiness and
Yes, yeah.
the occasional drink. And so I do all of the above.
Yeah, and I feel there's that real rhythm and pace and patterning that's very...
Well, I can't play a standard musical instrument, so I'm not afraid of singing without, as I just did with Roger, without accompaniment. Some people say, oh, I need a guitar or a piano, and that's usually the worst thing that I can hear. Someone says, I'll accompany you on my guitar, and I try to dodge that because they'll say, what key do you sing in? And I have no idea. Yeah. Nor do I want to know. As long as I can handle the key, I change and it gets me into strife a few times where you do a song and then they say, you're being filmed. And I say, let's do it again. And I sing it in a different key. And they said, you've just stuffed up everything. So I hope I haven't stuffed up your podcast, Sharon.
Oh, not at all. Anything but. Oh, no. I'm finding it compelling to just go back to Roger again.
Yes.
Because was he actually the one that started... Was he the one that brought the debates?
I'm sure he would have been, yeah. He'd have initiated. The rest were, he was the most outstanding scholar among them, but some of the others were quite good in their respective fields. You know, they knew a lot about cattle or horses, or a certain author was a favourite. And
yes.
Yeah, but Roger was the initiator, and he was more or less the compere of the debates.
Yes, yeah. And he was the one that would set the debate topic.
If no one else had a topic, he would propose 3 or 4, and they would choose one. And but it was delightful to be among them. And I've always marvelled throughout my entire life of being paid to do things that I would pay to do. And my whole work life, working among Aboriginal people in the most interesting situations, where I was never Mr. Egan, I was always Ted Egan or Ted Egan, and I've asked thousands of questions and was always treated politely, and they gave me generous answers, and as a consequence I'm well informed on traditional Aboriginal issues. I can speak a bit of language, and I just marvel at the fact that I've been so fortunate.
Have you written any songs in language?
Oh, yes.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we had a folk gathering in town here last night, and the song I taught them was in the Pitjantjatjara language. Kulil Katima, and it goes on like that, and they delighted in it because they were all white people present, and none of them could speak language. And kids especially love to learn songs in Aboriginal language, and we've got a musical that another young man has taken over from me, and he's a man named Dan Milne. He will do this. It's called Say Good Day, and it was prompted by, I went to a barbecue one day, and the kids, all their parents, had been born in other countries, and they all started establishing all these different words for good day, like Komista and Jakshamash and so on. And I wrote my song, Say Good Day, You Aussie Kids. Now in the new version, we've got all these Aboriginal good day words, Ngintangwiri and Yontubalya and so on, and they intersperse that with Say Good Day, You Aussie Children, Say Good Day, You Aussie Kids. And I won't be running that because Dan Milne, who's a very talented young man here, is very strong on some of my songs better than I know them myself these days. And he wants to put it together, so over to Dan.
Oh.
But a few of them will be in language, and lots of reference to the value of language. And indeed, one of my proposals in life is that the language pitch and jar be the language that comes to be known as Australian, and every Australian kid learns it as a matter of course in school.
Yeah.
And we go to other countries in the world and we start among ourselves speaking Australian on the cricket field and things like that.
Yes, yeah.
Even South Africans can teach us a thing or two there. And New Zealand has turned their somewhat dirtish national anthem into a work of great musical excellence with the Aotearoa translation.
Yes, yeah. Do you know, Ted, you're like the library was brought to, the 1,000 volumes were brought to Booraloola, but it's like you have brought thousands of volumes of story to the world through your songs.
Well, I have no option other than to do that because that's what I do. Whether I'm in a good mood or a bad mood, I'm always singing something or composing something, and most of them I'm happy about because I don't. There are a few that I've started and discarded over the years, but not many. It's got to be a worthwhile topic for me to have it implanted as a theme in my mind, and then it can happen quickly or surely or slowly, depending on the outcome. And but I am very pleased to hear you say what you just said. Thank you.
And your lived experiences, have really been the catalyst for every song that you pen,
Well, yes, certainly. I don't write songs that just say, I love you, baby. But and I get very bored with the songs that keep repeating, I love you, baby, and I do love you, baby, because I love you, baby. And you think, yeah, well, get it over you. What's the guts of the song?
Yes, yeah. Yes, no, there's always a story to tell in your songs, and yes, the experiences that you've had. So that the Roger song was the first of the songs, and then there must have been other songs that came out of Booraloola, or
yes, the Reluctant Saddler. I did one, the Reluctant Saddler.
Yes.
And I wrote a song about Harry Redford, the man from Captain Starlight, as he was known.
Yes.
And King Paraway, I wrote about Nat Buchanan, the famous drover. I wrote a song about Edna Ziegenbein, the famous woman drover. And it's interesting that some songs are guaranteed winners at a show. And I often quite deliberately sing my first 10 songs, and then I have a break and people say, hey, all of those songs are about women. And I say, yeah, well, they're 51% of the population. There'll be a few about men in the next half, but hope you don't mind. And the people say, no, that's okay. So, and I've had some wonderful experiences. I did a song called Survivors, and the first verse was about the famous Vivian Bullwinkle. And I knew she was still alive, and I found out that she lived in Perth. So I went to the Perth phone book and there was Bullwinkle. And I rang the number, and she said, Vivian Bullwinkle speaking. And I said, it's Ted Egan from Alice Springs here. And she said, I'm one of your greatest fans. And I said, wow, can I just ask for your permission to mention you in a song that I've written?
Oh, wow.
And she said, go for your bloody life, Sonny. And so I wrote this very good, dare I say, song called Survivors. And it's about Vivian Bullwinkle, Betty Cuthbert, and a recent verse about Julia Gillard, who was being very badly treated. So I thought she'll survive because she's a survivor.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so
I'm finding it very hard not to have my teacher hat on here, like you would have too, but with all of the rich information that has been crafted through your songs that, we can access, that teachers can access, that students can access, to find out about people that have never popped up on their radar before, to think about who is this person? Let me find out more about that just by you referencing them, or even, like you say, a song about survivors, and yes, what groups these people together, what have they survived, to...
Well, if you can send me an email, Sharon, with your postal address, I'll send you a couple of very relevant books and CDs to the topic we've been discussing, the importance of music. Yes, and there's a book that I did with a double CD companion, and that's one of the paradoxes, enigmas of my life, that I quite often do a book and a CD together. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that bookshops don't sell music, and music shops don't sell books, and so they don't sell all that well, although some of my stuff has been wonderful sellers. Mm-hmm. This particular book called The Land Down Under, which has a double album, a double CD, 40 songs, and a book about the short history of Australia, and it sold nothing. So I'll send you a copy, because it's. Wow. I just happen to have a pallet of books in my store that are unsold, and it'd nice to get it. But it's hard even to give books away these days, because the post and delivery is so expensive, and I'd willingly give these away to anyone who wanted to, but you've got to pay the postage, and I've got a thing called the Anzacs kit, and a box of Anzacs books to post anywhere is $90 to the cheapest place. Right. So that's the big issue, that yes, I own all my own product, and it's there, and most will probably go to the dump when I die, but that's all right.
There may well be some listeners here and libraries who might have their radars up, thinking, right, let's contact Ted, and to organise to pay postage for those things would be so good for people to add those to collections.
If you give me a post, I'll send you one of that. The Land Down Under, it's a book and a double CD.
Thank you.
You do a chapter on migrants, or you do a chapter on bushrangers, and you do a chapter on Anzacs, and you do a chapter on pearl divers, and then you listen to the songs that are relevant. Yeah.
Oh, this sounds like an extraordinary resource.
Yeah. Well, I like to think that it is, and it was released in the UK and in Australia, and it didn't go anywhere in either place for whatever reason. Oh. Never mind.
Well, let's see if we can get a revival on it.
Yes, okay.
Yes. Oh, well, Ted, that's just been an extraordinary wander through story and history, right to one little place and a library. Like that's what's prompted all of this, is the story, and that is an extraordinary vision that police officer had to say, we are going to get books. I can't believe they got that many books.
Yeah, we need a bit of culture. Yeah.
Yes. And I think for us as teachers and leaders in schools to be thinking, books have got the exact same relevance and importance and critical nature now as they did then.
Yeah, but music is so important. Let's stop killing one another. Let's start singing to one another.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's what I was wanting to say. I did get back my train of thought about that. For these things to happen, just like that police officer had to do, to reach out and make that happen, so do we in schools. We need to, if we say books and story and music and all those things are important, we really need to go out and make those things happen for our students too. Yep. And even though I love with that policeman, pop them in the cell because they're going to be read. We can put books in schools, we can put books in classrooms, but we have to also provide real access and engagement with those.
Yeah, the incentive to read. Yes.
And Roger got it right, didn't he? You know, with that
he
knowledge.
certainly did.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let's talk, because debating, talking and using and building on that knowledge are just such powerful pieces for us as human beings and for us to engage with each other through the story and what it is that people are bringing to us through their thoughts and ideas that they create and through the experiences. Thank you so much, Ted. It's been brilliant to engage with you today. Fantastic.
Thank you, Sharon.
Some of the research that we'll be referring to today, so that as part of the show notes, we'll be linking you to a book by Stephen Krashen called The Power of Reading, or Stephen D. Krashen. Krashen is a linguist and educational researcher who is Professor of Education at the University of Southern California. He has a tremendous book that I absolutely recommend to you all called The Power of Reading: Insights from the Research. So his first edition of the book, 1993, was updated in 2004. We don't have a free version of that for you to access through the show notes, but I want to draw out from it some of the key points that he makes around the importance of access to books. So he talks about, and if you head into, I do believe there are some PDF versions of the book online, and so you may be able to collect and reference from there. But I do recommend this as a book to add to your professional reading library, especially if you are a leader in a school. And this is most appropriate for those in early years settings, through primary, through secondary, and also in relation to English as second language learners. But if we are wanting to think about developing students who, if we talk about language education, and if we said what's our major goal of language education, it should absolutely be about encouraging students to be reading, and reading books of choice, reading with accuracy. If we related to Richard Allington and Rachel Gabriel's Every Child, Every Day, they talk about that every child should be able to read books that he or she chooses, to read accurately, to read something they understand, that they can write about personally meaningful things, that they can talk with peers about reading and writing, and that they get to listen to a fluent adult read aloud every day. So Krashen draws a lot on, so because this book, The Power of Reading, is insights from the research, you'll find a lot of our favourite, well, not just our favourite researchers, but researchers that we talk and reference quite a bit. So Allington, Linda Gambrell, Rachel Gabriel, Leslie Mandel-Morrow. But all of them talk about one of the major goals of language education should be to encourage free reading. Reading of choice, reading that is right for us, reading that can empower us, but we are the ones that need to make sure it happens. So I love the thought that, yes, we can bring books, and in this podcast, Ted's talking about, well, books were brought to, this community, but then the policeman put them in a place where they were going to be read, where there was absolute access to them. So they weren't popped away on shelves somewhere where nobody could access them, but they were placed strategically so that they could be read. So Krashen makes the point here that many of us have said that we know the importance of students having books to read. We get that, we understand it. And sometimes we bring those books to our students, but it isn't just a matter of bringing them to them. We need to have our children engage with them. What are we going to do to help them engage with those books? So we really want to be able to make sure that students have access. So what does the research tell us, firstly, about access? Number one, more access to books at home results in more reading. Better classroom libraries result in more reading. Better school libraries result in more reading. So right there, 3 places where access to books, home, classroom libraries, school libraries, any and all of those equal more reading. So books at home, classroom libraries, school libraries, public libraries. So our public libraries out there, if our students are engaged with and know that they have access there, then that also results in more reading. Now, I'm not going through the details of all of these things because these are all in this fabulous text by Krashen that gives all of the research about those things. And I think if you're a school who's really thinking, all right, what is it that we can do? What are the most powerful things that we can do that would make the biggest difference to the reading growth of our children? This chapter, all about access to books, is actually something that I think really will challenge us, and a bit like Ted's talking about with debating what would we need to do to really make access to books something that was a focus for our school, that really made a difference. We might have books in there, but what more can we be doing to have our students really engage with those books and to really be thinking about, out of our students, who does have access to books and how are they accessing them? Some of the other points made in here, the richer the print environment, the better the literacy development. So the richer our print experiences, the better our literacy development. So I think a lot of these things, none of them are new thoughts to any of us, but I think the how we go about doing it is sometimes the thing that we need a little bit more, we need to go a bit deeper to think about what is it, what's the vision that we have to make those things happen. A lot of children do rely on libraries for books, and so libraries are a really critical part. If our students don't have access to a public library because they're not being taken to one outside of school, having schools organise trips to libraries, or really increasing the school library or classroom libraries. In fact, the more we can increase each of these experiences, the better it is across all of those areas. One of the other points made in this chapter about access to books is about for those children who don't have as much access to books outside of school, that is a school with many children in that situation really needs to put themselves at the forefront of thinking their students have less access at home, so the more access that can be provided at school, the stronger that will be. So we do know that schools can counter the effects of poverty through access to books. And whilst it's true that children of poverty will have less access to books outside of school, let's not make that true at school. And if we have 2 groups of children who may be in poverty, the group who's provided with more access to books will show more literacy development. So we absolutely know, the research is very clear that access to books makes a difference. So if we can keep that in our minds as schools, no matter what our school demographic, let's have eyes on our children and their access to books outside of school, and really ensure that what we are providing at school through classroom libraries, school libraries, access to our community libraries. I know many community libraries here in Australia will do bulk borrows for school libraries if we can't get to those public libraries or those community libraries. And I know many communities, rural communities, who make regular visits to the public library, to the community library with their students. So those relationships are really important, and we know that by opening up that access, the access continues. It doesn't stop. We just did it once. It actually increases the likelihood of students continuing to access texts and engage with them from all of those sources. So the importance of access is high on our agenda as teachers in classrooms, what access do our students have to books, and as leaders, what access and how do we find out which children do and don't. In early years settings, if children don't have books at home, really important for kindies or childcare centres to have plenty of access to books and plenty of read aloud happening. And they're things that we talk about a lot, and part of our timeless, what we refer to as the timeless teas. But what we're wanting to build for our students, of course, is all of that and what we refer to as the three selves, that self-direction and self-motivation and self-regulation, being able to give students that opportunity to be able to access books and then to be able to self-motivate, self-regulate, self-direct into that world of reading and language development that's so critically important. All of that research, we just know books in kids' hands and books in kids' lives, and that daily reading experience pays off dividends in comprehension and vocabulary and fluency and knowledge, building world knowledge and building language and understanding how grammar works and how words work. And in Ted's wonderful story of what those debates were all about, the level of language and understanding and insight that was drawn forth from their experience with high quality literature was really empowering. Just did want to mention one little piece from Krashen's, the summary of that research too, is that it isn't just high quality literature that's important. It's about really engaging with those texts as well, and students being able to find books that really mean, or have access to books that really mean something to them. The light reading, what research tells us, the comics, the magazines are critical parts of that. So whilst literature and those debates that Ted talked about could be at such a high level, and the language that was being used in those, we also know that our students need access to a wide variety of texts that they can engage with. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. We have loved to see that so many of you have subscribed to our episodes from all corners of the world. The Teacher's Toolkit podcast is all about giving you an insider's guide to top teaching ideas, tools, techniques in literacy teaching and learning. Please subscribe to our weekly newsletter via the website. There you'll receive advance notice on blogs, podcasts, events and ways to contact us. Thank you and all the best to everybody, our listeners. Until next time, bye.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.